Hi, I'm Alex Alvarez and welcome to Dynamics 3. In this video we're going to be using the Emit from Object tool, specifically surface emission, which allows us to take any surface, whether it's NURBS or polygonal, and get that surface to emit particles. And just with that ability, there's a very, very wide range of things you can do, whether you're taking an object and having it be set on fire, taking an object and having liquid move across it, having an object emit smoke, all sorts of obvious different kinds of effects. But the most important thing we want to talk about with surface emission is moving beyond sort of the generic result that you get when you apply surface emission to an object in your scene, whereby usually the particles are just going to emit uniformly from that surface. But we're really going to sort of look at some ways to get those particles to have a more interesting behavior as they move or emit from the object, so that it's not completely uniform, by using texture emission, as well as also using expressions to control where the particles are emitted from the surface. And so those are things we'll be talking about. Hope you enjoy the tape.
Okay, so we're going to talk about surface emission. And so I'm going to need to be in dynamics mode. And right off the bat, I'm just going to go and hide the UI just so we have some more screen space. But I'm going to get my channel box, time slider, range slider, and outliner to pop up, because that's kind of all I sort of need to work with right now. And so for surface emission, we need to be in dynamics mode. And in dynamics mode, if I go to the particles pull down, we'll see that we've got the particle tool, which allows you to sketch particles, create emitter, which allows you to create omnidirectional and volume emitters, and then emit from object. And that's what we're going to be focusing on for this tape. And so if I go to the options for emit from object, in here if I hit reset and close all the folders, under basic emitter attributes, you'll see emitter type, and you have a pop-up. Omnidirectional, surface, or curve. So we're obviously going to be focusing on surface. Omni or directional are used when you want to select vertices or particles and have them emit particles. And then curve is obviously used when you want a curve to emit particles. So surface is going to be our focus. So with emitter type set to surface, the first thing in here that you'll see is that we're going to have rate, particles per second. And this is something that really isn't completely accurate in the sense that you are not, right now it says 100, but we are not necessarily going to get 100 particles per second if you change some other things that you can do with this emitter, as we'll see later on. But right now, before I really start changing much, let's get a surface in here to use. So I'm just going to create a plane, and we'll start with something simple. And so with this NURBS plane, I'm going to go in and also, let's say, up the number of patches that this has, just so it's easier to see the wireframe for that object. And I'm going to turn on wireframe on shaded, just so when it's deselected we can see the wireframe clearly. And if we look in the channel box, we can see, if I say show shapes, or rather the outliner, that we've got the NURBS object and its shape node, transform and shape. Well, if I select that surface, okay, first thing that we need to be aware of with the surface, whether it's NURBS or polys, are its normals. So if I go to display NURBS components, normals, we can see that the normals are pointing up for that object, and so that means the particles will move in that upward direction. And now let me just go and hide those. And then go to the Emit from Object dialog box, set emitter type to surface. I'll leave the rate at 100, and I'm not going to touch anything else. And I'm going to hit create, because everything else is just the default options. Now if I hit play, there we go. So we can see that we've got particles coming off of that surface. Now those particles are small and not very easy to see, but they are there. And with those particles that are coming off the surface, you can see they are going with the normals. And let's now look in the outliner. And in the outliner what we see is we've got our plane, we've got our particle object, and then if I open up the plane, we can see there's its shape node, and there's the emitter. And so you can see that we do have an emitter object or node associated with that surface. And so this surface, if I do anything to it, like let's say I take the surface and I rotate it, you can see those particles will now go in that direction. If I take that surface and I non-proportionally scale it, or if I go and take the surface, grab its CVs, and move them up, that will also make a corresponding change, because those particles are coming off that surface. And so we can see those particles emitting with the normals, even though they are a little difficult to see. So let's go in real quick and get them to be multi-point, and let's up the amount so that there you go, a little bit clearer, so that now if I hit play, there we have it. So what I want to do is, so that I don't spend a lot of time always continuing to sort of tweak these particle shape nodes to change how they look, is I'm just going to every now and then import particle objects that already have defined looks associated with them. So I can go in here and select this particle object and delete it, which will leave the emitter behind that's associated with that surface. And also I'm going to grab the surface and just get it to be flat again for now. And I'm going to import a particle object. And so I'm just going to say File, Import, and let's say I'm going to grab this one. And then we can see a particle object and a couple fields just got imported. And I'm going to select the particle object and then select the emitter that's associated with the plane and go to Particles, Use Selected Emitter, so that the particle object that I just imported is now going to have its particles be associated correspondingly. And so we have some sort of green looking particles coming off of there. And if I now select the emitter for the surface, we can now start playing with some of these attributes. Okay. So the first thing, I'm actually going to get those particles to live a little longer. So let me just go and up their lifespan so that now they don't die quite so quickly. And with that done, clicking on the emitter, let's look in the channel box. So in the channel box, we can see that we've got our emitter type set to surface. Underneath that, we have rate. So obviously, if I put that to 5, we're going to get very few particles. If I put that up to 5,000, you're going to get a very, very dense number of particles. So that's kind of an obvious attribute that is a very common attribute that you will work with. Okay. And so the next thing in here is scale rate by object size. And that's something that literally means that if you scale your surface, okay, it'll change how many particles per second are emitted from that surface. So that if I go to the emitter, I'm going to put the rate to something really small. I'm going to take the rate and put it down to 5. And if we hit play, we can see very few particles. But if I turn scale rate by object size on, so I'm just going to hit 1 because it's a Boolean, and now hit play, you can see we got quite a few. And so that's something to remember. Whenever you're going to turn scale rate by object size on, have a low rate. And so at this point, let's say I take that surface, that NURBS plane, and I scale it down so that it's tiny, and hit play. You can see how many particles we're getting. Then I'm going to scale it up and hit play. And we get a lot more particles. Well, what the software is trying to do is sort of maintain an even density or distribution of particles in the scene as they emit from that surface. And so that's why it's automatically upping the rate for a large surface as opposed to lowering the rate if that surface is tiny. So the only times you're ever going to use that is when you are going to animate the scale of your surface. If you're not going to be animating the scale, you'll find it more intuitive to take scale rate by object size, turn it off, and then just work with the individual rate. So I'll just put that back up to, let's say, around 500 so that we can see where we're at. And then also in here with those particles, I'm going to grab that particle object again. And then while it's playing back, maybe play with the lifespan. So now maybe let's get it so they live about 2 seconds. And that's a little bit better. Don't want them going so high into the scene. So now we've got the particles coming off the surface. Go back to the emitter. What else do we have? Well, if we jump back to the creation dialog box. So I'm going to go to emit from object and go to the options. In here, underneath rate and scale rate by object size, we have something called need parent UV. And in parentheses there, it says NURBS. Because this checkbox, which is either on or off, is only something that has to do with NURBS surfaces. And need parent UV means that the particle object that is associated with this emitter will have the ability to use a couple read-only attributes, parent U and parent V. So right now the emitter, or the particle object that I have in my scene, this green one, if I go to the attribute editor for it and close all of the different folders, I'm just going to close everything up. The only folder we want to look at now is this per particle array attributes. And in here you can see your standard stuff, position, velocity, opacity PP, and RGB PP, which I've added. But we don't see parent U or parent V. But I can go to add dynamic attributes, click on general, go to the particle tab, and then in here we will see parent U and parent V. Well, I'm going to click on parent U and hit add. Click on parent V and hit add. And now what we can see is we've got these appearing in our per particle array attributes folder, parent U and parent V. Now those are only going to work if you go to your emitter, and in the attribute editor for that emitter, turn that checkbox on. So in here we can see need parent UV, and I'm going to turn that on. So I'm just going to hit that little check. By doing that on the emitter, for my particle object that I added parent U and parent V to, those can now be used or referenced in expressions. So again, you wouldn't write an expression directly on parent U or parent V, but what I can do is have something about my particles change based on where on the surface they're emitted from. So I'm going to go with these particles, and I'm going to change them so they look, instead of multi-point, I'm going to switch them to spheres. And let me just go in here, and we can see that they've got radius. I'm going to lower that radius down a little bit, and then I'm going to go to the emitter and also lower the rate down to about 100, so that now when we hit play, we can see those spheres coming off the surface. Well, the next thing I'm going to do now is I want the spheres to maybe get bigger as based on where on the surface they're emitted from, because your surface obviously has U and V. So if I turn the CVs on, I can see here is the start point of the surface. That one's a U, that's a V. So this is the U direction on my surface. Okay. And so I'm going to select the particles, and I want to change the radius based on their U, as far as where they're emitted in U. So to do that, I need to go to my Add Dynamic Attributes folder, click on General, and add radius PP as an attribute. So I'm going to hit Add. I can see radius PP is now popped up in my little per particle array attributes folder, and I'm going to write a runtime expression. And for the runtime expression that I'm going to write, I'm going to say that the radius PP equals particle shape 1 dot parent U. Okay. And I'm going to hit create. And now if I go in here and hit play, what we're going to be able to see is we're getting smaller particles at this part of the surface than we are at this part. And I'm also going to go in and enter that as a creation expression, so that the radius PP equals, and then particle shape 1 dot parent U. Enter that, go back, and then in here we can see the expression being functional as far as the radius. And so with these particles, we've got the smaller ones as well as the bigger ones. So we're getting some sort of difference in there just because of the fact that these particles have their opacity mapped, and spheres don't really like that. And so I'm just going to go and change the opacity and just get rid of this ramp that I have in there. So that now for those particles, I'm going to go to the radius or the opacity PP and just write a expression on that, saying that that equals 1. Enter. And then now those should be completely opaque. And let's go in here and make one other change. I'm going to just switch them out of sphere mode, because spheres really aren't something that like to be tweaked too much, and you're not really going to ever use spheres as far as rendering. I just switched them to blobby, and there you go. So now you can see that based on the U position on the surface that they're emitted from, we're getting a different size particle. And so on the left side, the particles are smaller because that's the start point of the surface, where U equals 0. And then on the right side, where U equals 1, we're getting that larger size. So that's sort of a simple example of utilizing need parent UV. So if I go in here, let's say we get this surface and just rotate it a little bit, we can see how we're getting that effect coming off there. So there's quite a few other things that obviously you could do by writing expressions, in the sense that instead of writing it that way, if I go back to the radius PP, you could write runtime expressions, in the sense that I could go in, or rather conditional expressions. So I could say if particle shape 1 dot parent U is greater than 0.5, then the radius PP equals 1, else the radius PP equals 0.2. And so if you just want to see what that expressions look like, let me just go and paste that in here, and that's already actually kind of in there. So you can see the simple conditional that I've written, so that the parent U is being referenced in a conditional to determine the radius PP. So if I go in here and close that and execute this, and so I'm just going to go in here execute that expression, and that would be a runtime, or rather a creation expression. And so let me enter that. Don't need it as a runtime. And hit play, and there you go. And so you can clearly see, let's get that surface and get rid of its rotation. Let's move this down a little bit. I'm going to scale it up. And then hit play. So now you can see that break. And so there's the middle of the surface where u equals 0.5. So we've got the small ones and the large ones. So need parent UV. Again, emit from object, and it's this little checkbox. And it just allows you to query that parent U and parent V attributes. Okay. So the next thing in here is cycle emission. And cycle emission is something that's used to create loopable particle animation for game stuff. And it also can be used for creating some sort of interesting effects, where what happens by default in Maya when you hit play, as we can see, is that every frame the particles are emitted from a different point of the surface. So things look a little bit random. Okay. But what I can do in here is, let's say I go in, and for that particle object, I'm going to go to radius pp and edit the creation expression so that they're all the same size. So I'm just going to go in here and say radius pp equals 0.5. And get rid of this. And get rid of that. Edit. So now my expression, or creation expression, is very simple. Meaning, you just want to see what it looks like. That. So radius pp equals 0.5. I'm going to enter that for my creation expression so that now all of my particles are the same size. And then I'm going to click on the emitter, go to the attribute editor, and then I'm going to turn on cycle emission. So that instead of it behaving like this, where every frame the particles are emitted randomly from different points on the surface, if I turn it to frame and hit play, we're now going to see this, where those particles are being emitted every frame from the same region of the surface. And so if I start increasing the rate, right now the rate is at 100, if I put it to 500, we're just going to get more particles, but they're still going to be using the same distribution as far as where on the surface they're emitted from every frame. Okay. So by going and leaving that on frame, underneath cycle emission, you then have a cycle interval. Right now it's at 1, which means that the random pattern is sort of every frame cycle. So meaning that every frame it uses the same distribution. If I put that to, let's say, 5, what's going to happen if I hit play is now we're going to get a lot more emission of those particles, but every 5 frames it's going to repeat the random sequence that it uses. So basically you could go in, and let me change those particles back to, let's say, multi-point. Let's put them to multi-streak, so that we've got these particles looking like this again, and maybe I'll get the tails to be a little longer. If you wanted to create a loopable animation from what we're looking at right now, all you would need to do is figure out how long do the particles live. And so we go up here to the lifespan for the particles, and we can see that the particles right now live between 2 seconds or between 1 and 3 seconds, because we have a random range. You'd want to make it constant. So I'll get it so the particles, let's say, live 2 seconds. So that's 60 frames. And then in here for the emitter, where it says cycle interval, I'll put that to 60. So every 60 frames, it'll repeat the emission pattern that it's using, and the particles live for 60 frames. And then in here I can play with my rate of the particles. And so now when I hit play, basically every 60 frames it's going to repeat. And so if you kind of take let me just go and up my range up to, let's say, 5,000. When I play this, if you kind of stare at it close enough, you'll be able to tell that every 60 frames we're seeing the same thing, meaning that you'll see the same sort of particles pop up in the same places. You really kind of need to pay attention to it, but that's what's happening. So, and you can see it, you can't really tell that it's looping, and that's the point. You don't really want to be able to, but it is. You just have to make sure that you don't have animated fields for this to work, meaning that your fields are static. So for a turbulence field, for example, you wouldn't want to animate the phase. And we can see in here that turbulence field does have the phase animated. So let me actually go and delete that so that our fields are all static. They don't change. Because if they're changing, then you'd have to make sure that they change in a fashion that's the same over that 60 frame cycle that you want to loop. Okay? And so there you have it. So that's what cycle emission is for. Next thing in here, if we go to emit from object, is once you understand your basic emission or basic emitter attributes, you then have some other folders, specifically distance, direction, and then your basic emission speed attributes. So what we're going to do in here is, let me go back to this phase, edit the expression on the turbulence field so that phase z equals time times 2, just so that our turbulence now is animated again. And for my emitter, I'm going to turn cycle emission back to none so that we get our random distribution every frame. So now when I hit play, things are looking like this. And then for the emitter, we're going to go to the attribute editor, and we'll see that we've got our distance direction attribute folder for that emitter. In here, the only things that you can use are min and max distance, and those are pretty obvious what they are. If we look at how those particles are emitting off the surface right now, if I put my max distance to 10 units and my min distance to 9 units, you will see that those particles are emitting with a certain distance away from the surface. And so this is something that can be very handy, especially when you're dealing with sprites, where if you have a sprite that's like, let's say has a size of about 2 units across, you'd probably put your min distance to 2 units, just so that your sprites don't clip your surface. And so in here we can see that if I took those particles and then put their render type to sprites, okay, at this point they wouldn't clip anyway because they're pretty small, but if those sprites were a little bit bigger, so let's say I go up there, scale Y and X, okay, at this point you can see that they're not going to really be sort of clipping that surface because I changed the min distance. But if I went to my emitter and go to the attribute editor and put the min distance to 0 and put the max distance back to 0 and I hit play, your sprites are going to be intersecting your surface, which isn't going to look good. Okay, and we're going to work more with sprites later on, but that's just something to keep in mind. And we're going to talk about those attributes again later. So that's your min distance and max distance attributes. The next thing that we're going to have is, let's get these particles back to multi-streak. Okay, so that there they are. And let's also up the rate a little bit. Let's put it up to 1,000, so it's a little bit denser as far as the particles as they're coming off that surface. And now let's take a look at, in the attribute editor, the next folder, which is your speed attributes. In here you've got speed, speed random, tangent speed, and normal speed. Your regular speed is pretty obvious. Right now the speed is at 1. Okay. Let's hit play and then change the speed. If I put the speed to 10, obviously the particles are going to be moving a lot faster as they're emitted off the surface. Okay. If I put the speed to 0, the particles have no speed when they're emitted. The only reason they're moving right now is because in my scene I've got a turbulence field and a gravity field. But if I grab those fields and delete them and now hit play, what we're going to see is those particles have no speed, and since they are multi-streak, you don't see them. So I'm going to take those particles and switch them to multi-point so that now we can see them. And so if we hit play, you'll be able to see those particles popping up on the surface or appearing. So they're appearing on the surface, they have no speed, and that way they're not moving. Go back to the emitter, put the speed to 0.1, hit play, and now they have a little bit of upward motion moving up from the surface. Okay. Let's say I put the speed to -5. Now they're moving down. So I did talk about the importance of the normals of the surface, but at the same time it's not a big deal, in the sense that if your normals are pointing in the wrong direction for how you want the particles to emit off the surface, all you need to do is give them a negative speed, and they'll go in the other direction. So now let me put them back to a positive speed. Okay. In here we then have speed random. Obviously that's going to randomize the emission. So if I put, let's say, speed to 5 and speed random to 5, okay, what you're going to get is basically, if we go back to frame 1 and hit play, some particles will be moving slower than other ones. And let's lower the rate down so it's a little bit easier to see this. Okay. And then in here, let's go and start playing with the speed random. So let's put the speed, let's say, to 2, and let's put speed random up to 5. And now you can see that. So some particles are moving slowly, while some particles are moving quickly. So some particles are moving so slowly they're not even moving at all. Some of them are even getting a negative speed, because if my speed is set to 2, and my speed random is set to 5, the particles are going to go and have a 5 unit per second variance in what they can go. And so you have to be careful where some of your particles are going to get a negative speed if your speed random is greater than the actual regular speed. So something to think about. But that's what speed random is going to do. Okay. Next thing we have in here is I'm going to put the speed to 0, speed random to 0, so my particles are just popping up on the surface. And then underneath those, you will see tangent speed and normal speed. And you'll also see those in the attribute editor, tangent and normal. Well, by default, with surfaces, if I put the speed back to 1, your normal speed will be at 1, meaning that the particles are emitting by default with normals. If I put normal speed to 0, you will see that even though my speed is at 1, with the normal speed of 0, the particles are not moving in any direction. They are not moving up or down, okay, on that surface. But then we have tangent speed. And I'm going to put tangent speed to 1 and hit play. And now you'll see this. Our particles are moving in the tangent to the normals, so they're basically moving along the surface. So if I now up my rate, let's say to about 500, we're getting this sort of appearance of particles just sort of moving along that surface. So you can imagine that if you sort of really quick needed to sort of take a surface and get like a sort of bunch, like a big crowd of people just moving around that surface in random directions, you could get these particles to behave this way and then instance animated geometry onto those particles. Okay, and they're just emitting with the normals. And so also in here, if I combine tangent speed with normal speed, so I'll put tangent speed to 1 and put normal speed to 1, those particles are going to kind of move at 45-degree angles off the surface. So if I put the rate back down to something low, if you look from the side, you can see how those particles are emitting. And let's also get those particles to be a little bit clearer. So I'm just going to up the multi-count. Okay. So you can see they're sort of emitting at 45-degree angles. So going to the emitter. Okay. So again, tangent speed 0, they go with the normals. Normal speed 0 and tangent speed 0, they don't have any speed, even though our speed attribute is at 1. Put the tangent speed to 1, now they're moving in this direction with the normals of the surface, or against the normals of the surface. And then I can start upping my regular speed, put that up to, let's say, 10, and now you can see how those particles are emitting off the surface of that object. Okay? So at this point, those are kind of all of the attributes on the emitter that you can use as far as the basic attributes. So all of the attributes we see in the channel box, like volume and volume shape or a long axis, those are only for volume emitters. You're not going to be using those. So it's basically your speed, random, tangent speed, normal speed, and your distance. Directionality is not used either, direction x, y, z, because it's relying on the normals and the tangents to the normals for that emission. So just with simple surface emission like this, just with a plane, there's a bunch of different things you could do. Meaning that if I just go and make a new scene, if I just decided, okay, let's create another NURBS plane, let's scale that up, and then let's say emit from object, surface emission, everything is at the defaults, create, hit play, you can see those particles moving up. Put the speed to, let's say, -5, now those particles are going to be moving down. Now let's take those particles and switch their display so that they, let's say, live for a random range, let's say between 10 seconds plus or minus 3 seconds. And then I'm going to make them multi-point. Then I'm going to turn on color accumulation. Okay. And then with those particles now, we can see what they look like. And then finally, I'm just going to edit their opacity. So they all have opacity of about, let's say, 0.7. Just so those particles are now easier to see. And so obviously, if I just took this plane, move this up in the scene a little bit, maybe give it a little bit of rotation, maybe non-proportionally scale it, move it up here so that it's kind of out of my line of sight, and then hit play, you can imagine that you have, real quick, some rain, snow, all that kind of stuff, just by using a simple surface emitter. So I could go and grab these particles, throw a turbulence field in here, and for that turbulence field now, I'm just going to animate its phase. So let me just go in here so the turbulence field isn't static. And so let's say it just equals time times 2. And now when we hit play, we'll be able to see that those particles are kind of going in different directions. So you can see it sort of be more like a snowstorm. And then I could go and grab these particles at a certain frame and say save initial state, and then go back to frame 1, and they're going to stay there. So that now when I hit play, it continues from that point. And so you can see those particles coming down. And then at any point I could go in here for those particles and maybe cache in a few frames. Okay. So let's say I'll tell it to cache in like 100 frames. And so I'm just going to go to create particle disk cache. And in here, I just got to save the scene real quick just so that it has a name. And so I'm just going to call this test, save, and then let's go and cache. Go ahead. It's caching a few frames in. And now that this is done, I'm just going to go to about frame 50, go to the hardware render buffer, render attributes, and then I'm going to go in and turn on a little bit of motion blur and do a test frame. And so it's going in. Just got to wait a few seconds for it to go through those. And then what we're going to be able to see, they're a little bit dark, but you can see that they're actually getting blurred. Let's have it blur just over, let's say, 5 frames. So I'll set motion blur to 5. And let's take a look at that. And so you can see how they're streaking because of the motion blur. And so we just need to up the render passes a little bit so that we're not seeing those little dots because they're moving kind of quick. And so this is an alternate to using streak mode. But either way, you can see at this point it's looking a little bit more like rain. While if we just don't motion blur them and just do render passes on them, it's going to look a little bit more like snow and that kind of thing. So at this point, okay, another example, let me just go and make a new scene, is let's say I go in and grab this file, which is a simple sprite example. And let me just go and change the playback range. And there you go. But it's just a surface emitting particles, meaning it's just a plane where we've got these little sprites attached to them that just look like little snowflakes. Okay. But if we go back, they're just coming off of a plane. And so if I go and say show all, there's our plane. I just have the plane transparent so you don't see it. Okay. Another example would be in here. Let me grab, I think, this one. Okay. Where I've got some butterflies coming into the scene. And those butterflies are just instance geometry onto particles. But as far as how those are coming into the scene, again, the simplest thing that I use for this, okay, and we tumble around, again, is a plane. So I have a plane just emitting some particles to get those to come in from the side. And so if we go in, I think I've got just a QuickTime movie of that. So it's more of an example of instancing as opposed to emission, but you can see as far as how they're emitted into the scene, it is just using a plane. Okay. And again, another example, okay, with this, I've got some ships coming into the scene where, let me just go into shaded mode, and you can see those ships sort of coming around. But if I switch cameras, okay, even in here, okay, if I select back there, you can see, again, it's a plane. So I tend to find them to be kind of handy when I need to sort of get particles into a scene real quick based on a certain area. Because it doesn't have to be a plane. Obviously, it could be a spherical surface or a round surface or whatever. So let me go in, make another new scene. And now let's move on to a couple other examples of surface emission, okay, where we've got this solar flare type example. So if we move through this, we can see that we've got like this sun surface where the solar flare comes off. But again, this is another simple example of surface emission where I just have a sphere emitting particles. And so the little flare that we're seeing in there is actually a curve emitting particles. But all of the particles in here for the sun are just coming off of a simple sphere, where they just have a very short lifespan and don't live very long. So if I open that file up, and try and find it. And that file is this one. We can see in here that it's a sphere that's emitting particles, although I only have it emitting on the top half because we never actually see the bottom half of it. But if I go and say display, show, all, you can see the sphere. And so that sphere is emitting particles where if you select, or if I select particles, we can see that they don't live very long. So they live like half a second. And so if I go back in here and hit play, we can just see those particles that are coming off that surface. And they have heavy turbulence on them with a very short lifespan, so you get some interesting patterns emerging within the particles doing it that way. And then that's kind of it for that example. Pretty straightforward. Also moving in here, and then as far as how I got them to only emit on the top half, you've already seen that need parent UV. And so for here, we can go and say the lifespan PP, if it's, let's say, less than 0.5 in U, for parent U, then you can say the lifespan PP equals 0. And that way, they just immediately die if they're born below this half of the sphere. And so that's using lifespan PP with the parent UV attributes as opposed to the radius that we did earlier. Another example would be, let's say in here, let me grab another, see if I can find another movie. And here somewhere. Hand and blue burn. Here we go. Okay. This is actually an example of surface emitting particles. This is a hardware rendered example. This is just a test. And then let me just sort of jump to the... but you can see the surface right there where I've got a polygonal surface of a hand, which is skinned to a skeleton. And that poly surface is emitting those particles that are coming off of it. And so that poly object is actually a wrap deformer, which is deforming a NURBS hand, which has about 40 patches. But I didn't want to go and have all 40 of those NURBS patches emit particles, so I just grabbed the wrap deformer and had that emit the particles. And so if we actually look at the file that actually has the NURBS hand in here, you can see that in the end it still is the same difference. And then we can see those particles coming off of that surface. Again, just using a poly object as the emitter. And so if I can try and find that file, let me just go in, open, and that should be around here. And maybe. Let's just go and say hand emitting. Of course, that's what it would be called. And there you go. And so you can see in here that if I just grab this little locator, that it is just a wrap deformer that's skinned to the skeleton. So let me just go and move in here so it's a little easier to see. So I've got my little locator, and you can see I can go in, do all the different things as you'd expect. Spread the fingers and curl all the individual fingers, pinky, index, don't want to do that, middle, and so forth. But basically, it's just a wrap deformer. And then in here, I've also, if I get the layer bar to pop up, if I hide the wrap object, I can go and get the NURBS objects to pop up. And so those are the NURB surfaces. And so we can see there's a bunch of different patches. So again, instead of going and having those emit particles, I just grab my wrap object. And if you aren't skinning with wrap deformers, that doesn't matter. You can still just create a poly version of your character, object, whatever it is, and just have that emit particles and have that be skinned as well. And so in here, if I hit play, we'll be able to see those particles that are coming off that surface. Okay. And those are just some blobby particles that are coming off that are just rendered using a sampler info node so that they're more transparent in the center than the edge, and you can get some interesting results that way. But either way, just another simple example of surface emission. I'm going to make a new file. And so with these things understood, we now want to go and start getting a little more complicated in the sense of when we go back to the emit from object, we've talked about all of the attributes now that you can use in the creation dialog box. Because again, the volume folders, volume emitter attributes, and volume speed attributes would not be used for a surface emitter. Just basic emitter, distance, and speed. So with all of these discussed, then what more is there? And basically, what allows you to get a lot more complicated as far as the control that you have is if we go in and create another plane, get that to emit particles, emit from object, So there are the particles. Okay. And get some of the UI back. What we're going to see, if we go in here, again, let me grab that particle object, delete it, and then import a pre-existing particle object. So let's say I'll grab this one, and then open the outliner. Grab that particle object and that emitter. Use selected emitter. Let's see what we've got. Okay. So we've got these particles coming off, and they're a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to go and up the multi-count. And then also I'm going to up the rate, let's say up to about 1,000. So now when I hit play, it's a little denser, a little easier to see. Okay. Well, right now those particles are emitting off that surface uniformly, in the sense that the entire surface is emitting these particles. Okay. But we have control over that. And something that we can see is if you select the emitter and go to the attribute editor, close everything up, there is something in here that you do not see in the creation dialog box. Meaning that when you go to emit from object, there's something that you don't see in here, which you will see after you create the emitter. Just select the emitter, go to the attribute editor, and you're going to have a folder called Texture Emission Attributes. And that's what we're going to start talking about, is using textures to control your particles. All right, so to start talking about the texture rate, things that we can do, basically when you go into the Texture Emission Attributes folder for the emitter, you will see in here that it says NURBS surfaces only, because it uses UV information, but it can only use the UV information from maps that are applied to a NURBS object and how they're mapped over a NURBS object. So that's something to keep in mind. So when we look in here, what we're going to see is particle color, texture rate, which can both be mapped, and then you'll see a few checkboxes. And so what we're going to start with is we're going to start by just sort of focusing initially on, let's say, texture rate. And so I'm going to make a new scene in here. And with this new scene, again, we're going to focus or start with simple examples and get a little bit more complicated as we move along. And so I'm going to create a plane. And then I'm just going to up the patches on it. Turn on wireframe on shade. All right, so here's our surface. Well, basically, when particles are emitted off the surface, having them being emitted uniformly is useful for certain things, but if you can imagine using textures, the most powerful thing about that is your textures can be file textures that you paint in a 3D paint program. They can be animated textures that you create in all sorts of different software or manually. They can be image sequences. So if you have an image sequence of water caustics or an image sequence of an explosion, or if you have an image sequence that you created in a vector animation program like Flash, or a program like Painter, or whatever, any kind of sequence can be used, as well as procedural textures that you animate and design in Maya. And also you can use textures that you design and create in Maya using paint effects. And so we're going to talk about all these different things. And so to start, we need to sort of see the basics of how we can use textures. And so I'm going to go in here and just go and say in dynamics mode, emit from object, surface, create, so that our particles are moving up from the surface. And then again, I'm going to go in here, open my outliner, and for those particles, change them so that they are, let's say, different looking. And so I'm going to go and start with, let's say, this one. But for this one, let me make a couple quick changes, delete the fields, and then take that particle object, connect it to that emitter, and then say particles, use selected emitter, and there we have it. And then I'm going to take those particles and up their lifespan. Maybe they'll live 2 seconds plus or minus 1. Just so let's see what we've got. All right. And then for those particles, as they're coming off, I'm just going to go and edit the ramp that's on their opacity. Because in here I can see that I've got a fractal in there that's getting them to flicker a little bit. So a fractal is mapped to the ramp. But I'm going to go and break that connection just so that we've got this. Just so those particles over their lifespan just fade out. So we can see them fading. And then for the emitter, I'm just going to up the speed a little bit. So let's say they're living for, or have a speed of 2. So again, we can see these particles are being emitted off that surface uniformly. Well, let's see how we can use a file texture to make a change to how those particles are emitted. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do as far as working with this is let's start with sort of still images. And so for still image examples, I'm going to go in and open the multi-lister. And in the multi-lister, I'm just going to say, in here, let me just delete unused. And if I go to the textures, the only texture that I'm going to see in there right now is a ramp, which is the ramp that is used for the opacity of the particles. And also, let me up the rate on that emitter, so we've got some more. All right, well, I'm going to import a texture in here. So I'm going to go and say, Edit, Create. And for the texture that I'm going to bring in here, I'm just going to grab a file texture. And then for that file texture, I'm going to go and just grab something. So let's say I'm going to grab, what do we want? Let me just go to my project directory. So just let me scoot around in here and just go into my source images. And what I'm going to find in here, let me just say, show me all of my images. Let me grab something that would be useful. Let's say this. Okay. Well, what I'm going to see with this image is I'm also going to create a new material. And so the material that I'm going to create, I'm just going to create a Lambert shader. And I'm going to select my surface and assign that Lambert shader to it. And then for that Lambert shader, I'm going to take that texture that I created and assign that to the color. So that now what I'm going to see in here is this. And so with that texture assigned, we can see that that texture is just black and white. And so with that on there, I can use that texture to determine how my particles are emitted off the surface. And then also, like I've mentioned, you can use a texture to determine their color and their opacity. But right now when I hit play, you can see even though I've mapped that texture to that surface, it is not affecting the emission or color of the particles in any way. What I can do though, is I can go in and select the emitter and open the attribute editor. Now for the emitter, when you go and say texture rate enable or particle color enable, it does not look at the shader that is assigned to the surface. So even though I just assigned a shader to the surface, it will never look at that specifically. Although it is useful to assign the shader that you're going to use for your particles to your surface so that you can really see exactly how it's going to lay itself out. So if you need to make any changes, for example, if I wanted to go in here, I could grab that file texture, go to the attribute editor, go to the place 2D node, and I could go and make changes like rotation, or I could go in and translate the frame, change coverage to sort of size it up or down. So it's useful to sort of, first take that map, apply it to the surface, see how it's going to lay out, and then just sort of leave it in your multi-lister or hypershade if you like using hypershade. And so at this point, you then will grab the emitter. And first, let's start with texture rate. So on the emitter, again, I'm going to close all of the folders except for the texture rate folder. And where it says texture rate, or texture emission, you'll see that you've got texture rate, which is black, which can be mapped, but is not mapped with anything yet. And then underneath that, there's two checkboxes, enable texture rate and emit from dark. So obviously we need to enable the texture rate. So I'm going to check that. Then it has emit from dark. Well, look at our texture, okay? So for that file, do we want the particles to come off the surface where the word nomen is? Or do we want the particles to come off from the white area? Well, I want them to come off from where the word nomen is. And so I'm going to go and say emit from dark. And now I need to assign the texture. And to do that, I can just middle mouse button drag a texture from the multi-lister or hypershade onto texture rate. And with that done, I'm now going to go back and hit play. And there you go. And so now you can see that our particles are coming off just that region. And so now I need to increase my rate. Because even though it's at 500, that would be 500 if the entire surface was emitting. So now that we just have that small region emitting, I'm going to go and up the rate, let's say to 5,000. And I'm also going to take this surface and I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees. And then hit play. Okay. So you can see those particles coming off. Now the nice thing about the way we've done this is we're using the same texture that's mapped to our material is the same texture being used by the emitter. So that if I go and double click on my shader and make any changes to my file texture, for example, let's say I go and rotate it, I'll see it happen on the surface. And then if I go and I hit play, we'll see it update with the particle object. So it's a useful tip as far as going and assigning it that way. Because if you only assign the texture to the emitter and didn't assign it to the surface, it'd be hard to know what's going on. So let me go and put the rotation back to 0. And then I'm going to go and, now that I've done that, take my shader, double click on it, and I'm going to make it a little bit transparent so it's not quite so bright, so that it's kind of like dark enough that I can still see the word. But the thing is, maybe I'm not ever going to actually render this surface. I'm just using it for the emission of the particles. And so there are those particles coming out. And so if I go in here, maybe I'm going to grab these particles and assign a field to them. So I'm going to put a turbulence field on them, and I'm going to take those particles and put a gravity field on them. But the gravity field I'll make negative, maybe like -4. And then the turbulence field, right now, let's say that's okay. Okay. And we can see how those are sort of coming up off the surface. Okay. And so it's really a matter of sort of tweaking with all these different settings that you could go and have it look like there's the word gnomon coming off that object that's flaming or whatnot. But another simpler example of how you could go and use this is, let's say I just open a different file where instead of, or actually first let's start with this file for a sec. If I take my particles in my emitter and grab the emitter and leave the rate where it is, but I'm going to put the speed to 0. So that now when I hit play, the particles are still moving, but it's just because of the fields. Then I'm going to grab my fields for now, and let me just go get rid of those, so that when I hit play now, I have these particles just sort of emitting off the surface. Okay, and you can see the effect we're getting from that. So if I go to the emitter, select the emitter, now put the rate to like 10,000 so that it's a lot denser, okay, we can see what that's looking like. And so we've kind of got the word appearing in particles off of that surface. But since they're regular particles, those particles can obviously just be, behave in any way that you want. And right now they're not moving. So the color they're just getting from an RGB PP expression, right? It's just the emission on the surface is coming from a texture. So if I go, let me just sort of grab a simple example that's like along these lines, where if I find it, here we go. We'll see it's the same kind of deal. Let me just go and play blast this in, where the word gnomon appears with particles off the surface, and then eventually at a certain frame, we'll just see that the emitter I've got a cube uniform field in there, as well as a turbulence field, that then sort of come down onto those particles and then start blowing them away. Because basically, the emitter, the surface emitter that's emitting the word gnomon out of particles only emits for about, let's say, 40 frames. And then at frame 40 it stops, but those particles have a lifespan of about 300 frames. And so they had a speed of 0, they'll just stay there until a field turns on. And so I've keyframed my fields to eventually get those particles to move after they've been sitting there static. So if you ever need to have like a logo or something like that kind of sort of turn into dust and blow away, this is kind of a useful way to achieve that kind of effect. And so we'll be able to see in here how that kind of gets scattered and blown away as that field comes down. And so if I go and scrub through that, you can see kind of a cool thing that you can do just by using texture emission. So the next thing to talk about with that is in this file, if I just sort of start using this file as an example, is you'll see that those particles, their color seems to have a gradient in them. And so you can see it sort of seems to go from like green to blue down here. Well, that gradient is something that's coming from a file texture as well. It's not actually something that I've done by writing an expression. And so basically, the simple file textures that I have in here, if I just jump to Photoshop, as you'll be able to see that if I go in and grab my directory where those files are, if I go into, let's say, my projects, and go to my source images directory, textures, there is the image, which is that I'm using, just an SGI file, RGB file that's used for the emission. And then I have another image, which is this one, which just has color in it. And so two different images that are used for different things. And then also I could use in my color file, if I wanted to, I could give it an alpha channel where the particles could use the alpha channel to determine their opacity. And so I could go in here and maybe select all of that, copy it, come over here, create a new alpha channel for this image, and then paste that file in there. So I've got this is my RGB, this is my alpha, but then for my alpha I can go and load itself as a selection, invert the selection in there, and then I could maybe go in and create a gradient in there, for example. And if I do something along those lines, it just means that the opacity of my particles would be based on my alpha channel that I'm seeing in here, while my color is based on the RGB. But if we jump back to Maya, looking at this, okay, basically the way that that's assigned is if you just select the emitter and move down here, you can see that I've got inherit color checked. And so the same way that we mapped our texture rate is how I did the color, where if I just go into my texture tab in the multi-lister, I can see there's that file texture for color, and if I grab the emitter in the scene, I can just middle mouse button drag to map particle color. Just make sure that you turn on inherent color. And then underneath that, you will see that you have inherent opacity, which, like I just mentioned, will take the opacity from the alpha channel, color gain or alpha gain and alpha offset attributes of your texture file. And then underneath that, you see you have use luminance as well as invert opacity. So invert opacity is just going to invert the alpha channel that you're using, and then luminance is going to allow you to basically have the luminance be used as opposed to the color information if you wanted to override that and base it on the luminance of the RGB. So let's now move on to some other examples. So I'm just going to make a new scene. And also something real quick, which is just kind of, if I can find that one. Not that. Let me just go in here. And there's just a movie file that's just another example of that which inherit color. Here we go. So just having an image, okay, that's being used as the color for particles, so that if I hit play in here, we'll see how that just sort of explodes into a bunch of particles. And so simply just going and having a surface, like a NURBS plane, where that's the color file assigned to it, but then it emits particles, and so you can see that once those particles appear, they're getting their color from that texture file. And then I can just blow them away with a radial field and some turbulence inside there. And so also a very handy way to give you particles, very interesting color information that's a lot more dynamic and complex than what you can do intuitively by writing expressions, or at least for most people like me, where it's a lot easier to deal with file textures and crazy runtime rules or creation rules. So if I go in with a new scene, I'm just going to go and again create a plane. Turn on emit from object. Okay. There are my particles. And there's one thing that you need to know to get this to work, okay, about the particles for color. Whereby, if I go in for that emitter, and let me open the multi-lister, in my scene, I'm just going to go and grab a texture. And so let's say texture, file texture, and for the file texture, let me grab an image. So let's say I'm going to go into my texture map library, which is in here somewhere. And the image that I'm going to grab, let's say, is going to be this one. Actually, let me grab one that has a little more contrast. This one. And so for this image that I have loaded, if we just want to sort of bring it into the render view window so it's a little bit easier to see, and that file we're going to get to a little bit later on, so don't worry about the butterfly. Let me go in and jump to here, maps, and here we go. All right, so this is the file that I've loaded for my particle color. Okay. And so it's just sitting though right now in my multi-lister. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and select the particle object, or rather the emitter. So I'm selecting the emitter there in the scene. It's emitting the particles. Going to the attribute editor, going to the texture emission attributes folder, and where it says particle color, I'll just middle mouse button drag that file onto particle color from the multi-lister. And then I'm going to turn on inherit color. Well, with that done, if I now go back here and hit play, my particles are still gray. My particles have not gotten their color correctly. Okay. Well, what I'm going to need to do is for the particles, first I will go in and just change their lifespan a little bit, just so they're not going to live so long. Okay. And so they're dying out at a certain point. And I'm also going to change them, well, I'm going to leave them at points for now. But for the inherent color thing to work, you need to go and where you have your Add Dynamic Attributes folder, so Add Dynamic Attributes, click on Color, and you have to add your per particle attribute, your RGB PP, because an inherent color from an emitter needs the particles to already have an RGB PP attribute associated with them. And so if I do that, what I'll now see if we look at the particles is that now they are getting their color. They're a little hard to see right now, so let's switch them to multi-point. Okay. And then for the multi-point in here, let's go and change the count and the radius a little bit. And then also for their opacity, I'm just going to give them a opacity attribute so that I can use color accumulation. But for now, let's turn color accumulation off. And then I'm going to go and grab my emitter. I'm going to put the speed to 0. Okay. So they just sort of appear on the surface. And then for my surface, I'm going to create a Lambert shader, which I'll assign to it, so that I can make that surface a little bit transparent, so it's not really so visible. And let's move that surface up a little bit. And then now for the emitter, I'm going to put the min distance to 0.1 and the max distance to 0.1 so they're not emitted directly on the surface. And I'm going to put the rate up to about 10,000. Okay. And then hit play. And there you go. So you can clearly see right there how the texture map has been used to determine the particle color. And you can see how nice that looks and what a more dynamic, interesting color system that we're getting for the particles. That's really neat looking. And then of course, since they're regular particles, if I go in here, I can just hit play for a few frames, stop at this frame, select the particle object, and if I wanted to start at this point with the particles, I could go in dynamics mode, save initial state, so I can now grab that emitter that's in there, put its rate to 0, go back to frame 1, and there's my particles. And so now I could go and take these particles and assign fields to them and whatnot. So maybe we'll give them a turbulence field that has an animated phase. So the phase, let's say, equals time times 3. And then I'll also take those particles and give them, let's say, a vortex field. And that vortex field right now, I'm just going to give it sort of a low magnitude. And if we hit play, we're going to see those particles are now going to start moving around. And if I take the particles, let's say we turn on color accumulation. And let's hide the grid. Okay. You can see this sort of very interesting, and let's hide NURB surfaces. And go in here. All right. So there you go. So we have a much more interesting color pattern or color going on in the particle object. Maybe we'll go and up the multi-radius a little bit. And then just go in here. And there we have it. So particle color is working. But it's still a static image that we've been using right now. And if we go in, let's open the hardware render buffer, attributes, turn on multi-pass rendering, and then just so we can soften it up, and you can see that we get this nice feathered effect. Our plane is still popping up, and so that's just because it's visible. I'll take the plane and hide it. So you can hide the surface that's emitting your particles, and the particles will still be there. And so now you can see what an interesting effect that we have. So if we're doing things like nebula and galaxies where you need to have very interesting colors going on inside them, trying to just write a simple creation expression or runtime expression for that is going to be kind of complicated. And so if I go and let's say jump back to Photoshop for a quick second, let me just go and get rid of these. If you have images that you can grab anywhere on the web and whatnot, if you have some images of things like nebula, so you can see in here I've got several of them, but let me just go and open one of them. Okay, so this is just an actual image that I got from like some NASA site or something of a nebula, and so you can see there's very interesting colors that are occurring inside this, and so trying to figure out an expression to create that is going to be tough. So you can just go and have a plane emit particles where it gets the colors from this, and then get rid of the plane and have a nebula that already has the colors perfectly set from an image. Okay. And then also you can have the opacity set by putting an alpha channel where you just go in here for this image and say new channel, and then go grab your RGB, okay, grab it all, copy it, and then paste it into your alpha channel. And so your luminance in there is going to be used to determine the opacity of your particles, so that the particles in the center are going to be more opaque than the ones that are on the outside, which would sort of make sense with the image that we're looking at. And so now jumping back to Maya, you can get the idea of how that could be used. And so if I jump in here, let's say right there, okay. This is kind of like along those lines, in the sense of like what we're looking at there is using the same image that I just brought up in Photoshop. And so you can see that we're getting the particles to get their color based on that image. Okay. And so again, once you go into the hardware render buffer with a few passes and motion blur, hardware render buffer, okay, it's going to be nice and soft and feathered out. Okay. So you can see that very interesting soft feathered look that we're getting, that for doing those kind of effects can be really, really cool. But still working with static images. We haven't moved on to animated textures yet. And so that's really going to be the next thing that we're going to want to talk about, is using animated textures to determine our particle emission as far as color and rate. Okay, so to deal with animated file textures, we need to understand how Maya wants you to have your source footage ready. And so if you look in, I'm just going to jump into my particles directory and look at my images. Basically in here you'll see that I've got a bunch of file textures and a bunch of sequences. And you're just going to make sure that they're numbered where it's file.number, meaning that you don't want to have extensions. So in here we'll see I've got flame.55, .56, .57, .58, etc. Meaning that if I just jump into Notepad, it's just going to be filename.1 and then filename.2, etc. You don't want to pad them, meaning don't go and have .001, filename.002, etc. And you also do not want to have it where you have .1 extension. And so this is also something that Maya will not like if you're going to use animated sequences. So don't do this, don't do this, this is what you want. And so you can write things out from fcheck this way or using something like debabbilizer. So jumping back to Maya, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create again a NURBS plane, and as I've done a few times, make a couple changes to it, and now turn that into an emitter. And so I'm going to say particles emit from object. We'll see the particles coming off of it. I'm going to open the outliner, and then again I'm going to grab that particle object, delete it, and then go and import a particle object that I already have. And so for this one maybe I'll go in and grab let's say just this one, which we've used before. I'm going to delete the fields that are associated with it, connect it to that emitter that's associated with the surface, and then for that particle object I'll go in and up its lifespan a little bit so that it lives a couple seconds, so that now we can see those particles on there. And for those particles I'll also go in and make a quick change to their opacity ramp, just so that I don't have a fractal map to it. Alright, so here we go. So I can see I've got these particles coming off the surface. And so of course right now they're just emitting uniformly off the entire range of the surface. And for the emitter I'm going to up the range up to about, or the rate up to 1,000, so that we've got a little denser emission coming off that surface. So to use a file texture, there's a lot of different things that we could do as far as having animated sequences. So the first thing we are going to talk about is file textures, and we'll get into procedural textures and textures that we can design also using the Paint Textures tool and Paint Effects. So at this point right now, if I go out here one more time and I just jump to where I've got some maps, there's a lot of things obviously that you could use as far as sequences. And so an example in here is I've got some sequences that are photographic. So for example, things like fire that you can get off CD libraries. And so if I just go and click on one, this for example is actually some water caustics. And we can see this is a QuickTime movie, but you're not going to use QuickTime movies to map your particle emission. Because even though this is water acoustics, you can imagine if something like this was used to determine texture rate based on its luminance and also texture color, you could get some very interesting effects. Or just using it for rate alone and doing the color using another technique or another map. And so in here we've got, let's say, water caustics, as well as things that are just like actual photographic fire. But the thing is, if a map like this was used to determine particle emission, you'd get the appearance of the particles starting to emit at the bottom of the surface and then sort of growing up the surface, which could be interesting. So we're going to use this one called Starting Fire. And we'll see that if I look in here, again, that the file format is listed so that it's file.extension. And so we've got meaning a dot number. So we got in here 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, etc. So going to Maya, what I'm going to do to get this working is first thing I'm going to do is in the multi-lister, I'm going to go to the texture tab and create a new texture, specifically a file texture. And for the file texture, I'll double click on it and I'm going to grab one of those sequences. And so to use the one that I just talked about, I'm just going to go out here, go to the one called Starting Fire. And by default, Maya will not see things if they don't have an image extension. So where it says files of type, I need to go to best guess. And now in here I can see all my files. And I'm going to click on the first frame, which is called FR45.100. And you'll see this goes up to .199. And so it's about 99 frames. So I'll grab the first frame, open that up, And we'll be able to see just that sort of loaded if I look at the bottom right there. But what we now need to do for this file extension to work for the emitter is in the file node, you have to turn on use frame extension. And so I'm going to turn that on right there. And then where it says hardware texture cycling options, I'm going to go in here. And actually, I don't need to use that. That would be for sprites. We're just going to work with the file extension. Now, for the file extension, you could keyframe that manually in the sense that I could go to frame 1 on my time slider, and where it says frame extension 1, I could just go and set a keyframe, and then go to frame, or rather, I'm going to say frame extension is 100, right? Because the first frame of my sequence is .100. So for my frame extension, if I put 100, we can see that in there. If I put 150, we'll also be able to see that it now switched to frame 150 of that sequence. So you can animate that just using keys, but the way I'm going to do it, I'm just going to go and write an expression. One thing that I could do is I could say file2.frameExtension equals frame. Okay. But the thing is, we have to remember that we have frames 100 to 199. So I could say equals, let's say 100 or 99 plus frame. And so that at frame 1, it would be using 100, or using, yeah, exactly. And so we can see that in there. So if I say it equals, let's say 150 plus frame, then we're going to be able to see that it's using that frame. But if you want this to, let's say, do something like it could cycle or loop, you might write an expression that would say, in here you could say frame, and then we've got about 100 frames for that. And I'm going to use the remainder function. And so in here, if I go in here and say frame remainder 100 plus 100 and enter that in, as I go through, I'll be able to see that it's actually using those sequences. But when I get to frame, let's say 160, it's going to start cycling that. And so if you want to see the extension that I just, or the expression that I just wrote, let me just go and paste that into Notepad. And so if we take a look at that, this is what I have. And let me just go and get this so that we have a little bit more space in there. So file2.frameExtension equals, and then what this is basically going to do is loop it so that it's going to go and start at frame 100, and then once it gets up to about 200, it's going to go and return back to frame 100. So just see this as the remainder function, saying that when frame divided by 100 has a remainder of 0, okay, it's going to loop. And so in here we're going to say it's going to start at 100 and then do 100 frames from there and then loop from that point. And so minimizing this, that's the extension expression that I have. I'll close this now so that I can see, if I just look in my file texture and the little swatch right here, you can see that it is correctly going through that sequence. So the next thing that I want to do now is associate this animated file texture with the particle emission. And so what I need to do is select the emitter, go to the attribute editor, open the texture emission folder, and then in there I can simply middle mouse button drag that file onto texture rate and then say enable texture rate. And so at this point, if I go back here, what I'm going to see when I hit play is that it's going to actually use the file texture that I've animated to determine the emission of the particles. Okay. And so one thing that you may want to do though is increase your rate. I'm going to put the rate up to about 5,000 on the emitter, because it'll still use that rate as kind of like a multiplier for what's going on. And so what we'll be able to see in here is that the particles are beginning to appear at this bottom part of the surface, and then they're going to sort of move their way up. So it's going to go a little bit slow just because the sequence that I've loaded in is 640 by 480 as far as the size, and it's 100 frames, and so that's about 100 megabytes of imagery that as far as a sequence that it needs to load into RAM. So the first time it plays through, it's going to go a little bit slowly, and then it'll speed up the next time it plays, because it's going to get those things buffered. But you can basically see in here that it is working. So you can see that the color is still using the RGB PP expression that I have on these particles. But if I go back to frame 1 and hit play, you can see how much faster that just played back, because it's already buffered those into memory. And so now if I go back and hit play, once it gets to the point that I had previously stopped, it's still buffering in the next 40 frames, because again we have 100 frames worth that need to be brought in. So the benefit of something like this is if you have an object that's supposed to sort of catch on fire from the bottom moving up, you can see how using that image sequence can kind of give you that kind of appearance. So as far as this sequence that we've used, just using that one, we'll see that if I go and grab this QuickTime movie and play this one back, this is basically what we have. So using the sequence that I just used in this example, I'm using that same sequence in this QuickTime movie, where you can see that they sort of build in the lower right and then eventually sort of move their way up the surface. And then eventually the rate of the emitter I keyframe to 0, so that once it gets to about 100 frames in, it just stops and the particles die and disappear. And so it really sort of creates a more dynamic and interesting result as far as your particle creation into the scene using a file sequence. That file sequence could also be used for color, obviously, but in this case we're just sort of dealing with a simpler example. So as far as how you design your sequences, as far as your file texture sequences, there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing it. You can rely on sequence libraries, or you can create them manually. And now as far as manually creating file sequences to use for texture rate, you can do that using obviously a lot of different software. So for example, if you even have something as simple as Flash, I could go in Flash, and you may not be familiar with it, but I could go in and say, even if I just create something simple like this, where I go in and create a circle, create a keyframe for that circle, and then maybe create a few more circles in here. If I go to that keyframe right there, I can go and tell Flash to immediately go in and do that. So you can see just by having a circle at frame 1 and then again at frame 19, having these circles, Flash can interpolate. So this is a vector animation software package, but you can imagine if you use something like this for your texture rate, the kind of effects that you could get. And so if I go in here, I could go and let's say get another layer in here, hide that one, and you can see how Flash, if I go in and just create, let's say, a line like that, and then go to another frame, insert a keyframe, and then maybe I go in and delete this line but create another one. So let's say I'm going to create one which is a little bit different. You can get Flash to automatically go in, and I'm not using a stylus right now, so I'm going to go and be really rough about this. Let me go and grab a bigger one. But if you needed cracks to form on a surface, for example, where some cracks are forming, and then as those cracks form you need smoke to come out, you might have an animated image that you use, that you created, which is used as like a bump map, as well as using it as your emission map, as well as maybe multiplying that with your color texture, using color gain, all sorts of different stuff. So I'm just going to go to that keyframe at frame 1 and tell it that that's also going to be a shape tween, and you'll see how Flash will automatically go and sort of do that interpolation. And so obviously you can get a lot snazzier with what you do, but it's just giving you an idea of how to use different software to create your emission maps. And so now I'm just going to go in here and let's minimize Flash and go back to Maya. And let's see some other things that we can go in and do. Another file that I have, or another QuickTime movie that I can open up, is, let's say, if I go in and grab over here. This is the same thing, okay, where we've got a wall in here which eventually catches on fire, and we can see how basically that fire is sort of growing or moving up the surface, where it sort of starts in the lower right, starts moving up the surface, and then eventually sort of fills in these areas that aren't burning yet. And this is again using an animated file texture to determine our emission on that surface. So what we want to do now is sort of see some other examples that we can do using these kind of techniques. So, but instead of focusing on using file sequences that I have on disk, we're going to start focusing on using a couple things. One, using paint effects, and another using animated procedural textures. So to get into using or designing our emission maps completely within Maya, instead of relying on other packages or instead of relying on sequences that we've gotten from libraries, some things that we can do is I'm going to go in and create, or start by, let's say, creating a plane again. And for this plane, let's say I go in with it and up the patches on it, let's say to 30, okay, so that we can see that we've got a relatively dense plane if I turn the wireframe on. And this is something that I'm then going to go in, and let's say I jump to modeling mode, and I'm going to go to the Sculpt Surfaces tool with Artisan, switch it so it only brings things up in the y-axis using the sculpt variable, and then I'm going to up my radius a little bit, and maybe I'll sort of paint on this surface like so. And so maybe we're creating some sort of terrain or some sort of object that has a different shape. And then in here we need particles to emit sort of along that surface in different areas where maybe we want some fire over here and down here and whatnot. Well, instead of relying on trying to sort of abstractly use something like Photoshop, a cool thing to do is I'm going to go and open the multi-lister. And let me just sort of switch this so we actually have a multi-lister. And then I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a new shader for that object, specifically a Lambert shader, that I will assign to the surface. And then for that Lambert shader that's already assigned, I can now, in rendering mode, go to the Paint Textures tool. So lighting, shading, pull down menu in rendering mode, and then Paint Textures. And then going into the options for that, what I'm going to want to do is actually save my scene first. And so I'm going to go and say File, Save, and then let me just call this Test Emission. And I'm going to save that. And so it's got a shader assigned, the file's been saved, and then I'm going to go to the Paint Textures tool. And in here, you'll see that if I go down to the bottom, it says File Texture, Texture Attribute to Paint. And I'm painting color. Okay? It doesn't matter what I paint, because the point is the map that I create by painting in Maya, I'm eventually going to use as a particle emission map. So I'm going to say for color, first I need to click on Assign Textures, so that it creates textures for that surface. And I'm going to just do 512 by 512. Image format SGI is what I tend to use. And I'm going to hit Assign Textures. Now what happens is for that surface, it has created a file texture on disk that can be used to determine your emission, or anything. Right now it's color. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and take my color value slider, put it up to white, and hit the flood button. And so now you can see that my surface has become white, and that's now my color for my object. But then I'm going to go to the value and put it down to black, and then start painting. And so you can see I can use the Paint Textures tool. So as far as using the Paint Textures tool to actually design texture maps for like color, you're really better off using a program like Studio Paint or DPaint, because there aren't very good tools as far as designing your brushes or how the colors blend together and whatnot. But for doing something like particle emission, it actually works quite well. And so you can see basically what I'm doing here is wherever I paint in black is where I want my particles to emit from. And so at this point, now that I've done that, in the tool settings, I'm going to click on Save Textures. So I'm going to click that button, which is right there. So that if I now close this and get my multi-lister back, what we're going to see in here is that there's my texture that I've painted sitting in Artisan, or sitting in the multi-lister. So if I get Hypershade up, just so that it's a little bit clearer, this is what I've just painted using the Paint Textures tool. It's a regular file texture on disk, so if I double click on it, we can see that it just put it in my textures directory. And so since it's a regular file texture, it is something that you could open in Photoshop and edit from that point on. But what we're going to do now is for our surface, it's not emitting particles yet, but I'm just going to select it in Dynamics mode, say Emit from Object, Surface, regular surface emitter. We'll see the particles coming off. I, again, just grab that particle object that's in there, and maybe I'll go in real quick and make a couple, well, instead of doing that, let's just import one. So I'm going to import one of my particle nodes, and then for that, let me just go in to my outliner, grab that particle object, grab the emitter, use selected emitter. So now I can see I've got that sort of like greenish looking particle emission. For the emitter, I'm going to up the rate up to about 5,000 so that now we can see how those are coming off the surface. But then I'm going to click on the emitter, go down to the texture emission area, and then for texture rate, I'm going to turn on enable texture rate, and then I'm going to also turn on emit from dark, which is this checkbox right here. Because the way that I painted the map using the Paint Textures tool, I painted in black where I wanted the particles to emit from, so that's where I use emit from dark. And then I just go and switch over to my multi-lister, and then middle mouse button drag that file texture onto texture rate. So that if I now go and hit play, what we're going to see is the particles are emitting off the surface based on how I painted the texture. But one thing that can happen, if we look in here, at certain cases, particles will be emitting off the surface in places that we did not paint the color. In the sense that, like, I didn't paint things black, let's say right there. We know that it's white, but why is a particle popping up there? The reason is because what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this file texture. It's called test emission underscore NURBS plane shape. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to actually jump over to Photoshop and open that image. So I'm going to say File, Open, and grab the texture that was created, that I created in Maya. So I'm going to go to my textures directory for my project. I'll see there is that texture. I'll open it up. Now we can see it in Photoshop. So the first thing obviously you could do is you could go in and clean it up. Maybe I could go and grab areas that aren't as clean as I want. I could go in and grab the blur tool and blur things. You can do all your sort of regular type of Photoshop work on this image. But what you want to do is if I grab the eyedropper and click on where it's white, what you're going to see is that it's not truly white. If I look at the RGB values, it actually says 254, 254, 254, where it should say 255, 255, 255 for white. That's just a weird thing with the Paint Textures tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this image, go to the Levels filter in Photoshop, grab the eyedropper, click on an area that's supposed to be white, and then just up my levels on the right. And if I look in my color fields right here, it tells me how those are changing. So right now it says 254, 254. Start moving this to the left, and now it says 255, 255, 255. So that's how you can go in and sort of tweak the maps that you paint in Maya. So then I can hit OK, File, Save, to save that image, and then I can jump back to Maya. And in here for that image, I'll click the Reload File Texture button so that the changes that I made in Photoshop will get read. And so now when I hit play, that problem will go away. And you'll see that particles are no longer emitting in this middle region. Okay. So kind of an obscure little thing, but you got to kind of make sure you know that or else you're going to pull your hair out. So there you go. So now you can see the particles are emitting off the surface exactly where we want just by going in and using the Paint Textures tool. Very, very cool thing to be able to do directly in Maya without having to rely on a 3D paint package. And so with this, obviously there's a lot of flexibility in how you go in and paint your particle emission. Meaning that I very easily can just go in, and since I'm using the same texture, remember that if I go to my shader that's assigned to that surface, you can still see it there. Because in my multi-lister, the exact same texture file is assigned to the emitter as assigned to that surface. So that at any time I can go in here and decide, well, let's go to the emitter. And first let's up the rate to about 15,000. So those particles are really, really clear. You can definitely see those in there. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is select my surface, go back to rendering mode, and then go back to the Paint Textures tool. And then in here I can start making changes, just like that. So I can decide, well, actually, maybe I want some particles to emit right there and right there. And now if I go and hit Save Textures and hit play, now we can see our particles emitting from that region. So we're getting instant feedback. So I can just say, maybe we want some particles right there. Save Textures, go back, hit play, and there they come. Or I can go and flood it with white, okay, go back to black, and then maybe just sort of paint some lines in here of where I sort of want some particle emission. Okay. Save Textures, and then play. And now we can see that maybe I'll sort of go and turn off the texture display for the surface, and we can see how we're just getting these sort of lines of fire. And so very, very quick way to sort of take objects and design their particle emission. So this is specifically useful when you don't need to have an animated map, where you just need your particle emission to be consistent as far as where it is on the surface, but it doesn't necessarily change over time. So other things that we can go in here and do, instead of using the Paint Textures tool, is that one thing that you will notice is right now we're dealing with a plane. And so the plane right now, we don't have to worry about tiling as far as having like a tileable texture. But if we had something like a sphere or a cylinder that we were trying to design emission on, you might want a tileable texture so that your seam isn't clear. And so for something like that, we can go in and I'm going to make a new scene. This time I'm going to create a cylinder so that we can see this kind of example come into play. And for this cylinder, again, I'm just going to up the number of spans that this thing has. Okay. Turn it into a surface emitter. So I'm going to go Dynamics, Emit from Object. We can see the particles are emitting with the normals. Again, I'm just going to go and grab the particle object and delete it. And then in the outliner, I'm just going to go in, import a particle object, okay, and then connect it to that emitter that's associated with that cylinder. we'll be able to see there's those green particles coming off. Okay. I'll click on the emitter and up the rate. Let's put it to about 1,000. Okay, so we've got a little bit more coming off of there. And then I'm going to go in now and try and figure out how to paint my emission. I'm actually going to put the rate up to 5,000. And now we can see those particles coming off that surface. And so to design the emission map, this time I'm going to use paint effects. So I'm going to use a sort of a different technique to go in and design the map. And so to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and switch my left panel here to be the paint effects panel. And in the paint effects panel, you can see I already have something loaded in here, but I'm going to go in and say, in paint effects, I'm going to clear the canvas. Okay. So again, we're in paint canvas, not paint scene. And then I'm going to go in and say, set size. So canvas, set size. This is where you will determine the size of the texture that you're going to paint. So again, I have it to 512 by 512. Set size, and now we can see in here that white canvas that's been created. The next thing that I can go in and do, and I'm just going to also hide the channel box for a sec so we have some more room, is in the paint effects panel, I'm going to go and open visor. And in visor, let me just get visor to be a little bit smaller. And I'm going to open up the brushes tab and just go in here and try and find something that might be useful for what I need to do. And so let's say I grab markers. And so we can see I've got these different markers that I can use. So I'm just going to click on this black one. And I'll be able to see that if I go in here, I can now paint. And I'm going to go and hit undo for that. Then for that a brush that I just chose, let's say instead of dealing with a marker like that, we go and grab something like one of these different glows. Okay. You can use any of these different things, obviously, to design, let's say, one of the different grasses that we have. And I go in, grab one, and I can now paint. And you can imagine what these would be like if these were used as particle emission textures. Let me go and do an undo again. So, but for a simpler example, let's just deal with a marker. Now the marker, you might not be happy with its radius or its size. And so to change that, I'm just going to go and open, need to be in rendering mode, paint effects, template brush settings, which will give me the settings for the brush I'm currently using. And I just need to change its global scale. So if I up the global scale a little bit for this brush, I'll be able to see that it's going to be a little bit bigger. So that now I'm going to do canvas undo one more time. And now I can go and paint a texture. But in here for the texture, you'll see that when I paint in the paint effects window, it doesn't create a tileable texture. The way that you can do that is if I just go and sort of expand the paint effects canvas a little bit, okay, and actually let's go in here. What we want is we want to turn on wrapping so that it wraps the paint that we do in both the horizontal and the vertical direction. So to turn that on, I'm going to go to my paint effects globals. So just paint effects pull down globals. And if I go to the canvas folder, in here you'll see wrap H and wrap V. I'm going to check both of those, close this, and now what you'll see is when I paint in here, automatically it wraps to the other side. And so this way you can create textures which will be tileable. And so that's a really neat thing to be able to do. So I'm going to go and just clear my canvas and just go and size it a little bit so that we can still see our object. And I'm going to paint a texture that kind of tiles a little bit. And so maybe I'll go in here and create something that kind of looks like that. And I know that this is going to tile if I use it for my object. So I can now go to Canvas and say Save As, and it'll save it as an image. And so I'm just going to go and save it to my, let's say, go in here to my Maya projects directory, particles, images, or actually let's put it in source images, textures, I'll just call this test. Save that. And at this point, it used the image format for my render globals, which is if. So that's the image format it saved it as. But then what I can do is now go open my multi-lister. Okay. I'm going to go and create a new texture. So texture, file. And then for that, I'm going to go and grab that image that I just saved. And so again, just go into my Maya projects, particles, where I put that in source images. In here I'll see there's going to be an image that's going to be called test. And so I'm just going to need to scroll down to find it. There it is right there. I'll open that up and we can see that loads. So now that's going to be sitting in our multi-lister. Then in here, I can go and grab my emitter and then open the attribute for it. And then for the emitter, go down to texture emission, enable texture rate, emit from dark, middle mouse button, drag that file texture onto texture rate. And now when I go in and hit play, there you go. And so you can see that we have emission, but it's a tileable texture, so you won't be able to see where it's repeating. And so this way we've got our emission on our surface in a pretty cool way, just using paint effects. And then what's really cool in here is that I can go in, make changes in the paint effects window. So let's say I go in, do a couple, just paint a couple little dots or whatever, go back to save, and then when I hit play, it will immediately update. So you'll see that now I'm getting that emission from that spot right there. So then again, let's say I go in and you just say clear canvas and just paint a couple dots on here and then save. And then in here it's going to ask me for a name because I did a clear, so I got to call it test again. And then when I hit play, you can see that emission update. So another very quick way, but the nice powerful thing about using paint effects is the tileable aspect. Okay. So if I go back to, let's say, the point where I had, let's say I'm going to clear, and then get back to having this kind of map designed in this fashion, where if I go back, save this, hit play, and it's asking me for that because I hit clear. So save, replace. There's our emission. I'm going to put a couple more lines in here. So I'm just going to go in here and get it so that we've got tiled like that. Save. Play. Now let's say you want that fire or whatever it is that's emitting on that surface to sort of crawl its way up the surface in this spiraling pattern. Well, we've used paint effects to go and design the initial map, but then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to the multi-lister. And in the multi-lister, I'm going to now use procedural approach to augment or design that map. So let me just go and say delete unused in here, just so we're only looking at what we've worked on. So here we can see our ramp, right? Our file texture that we've used. Okay, that's mapped onto that surface. Well, you are perfectly allowed when you're doing texture emission to go to your procedural textures and tweak them. For example, by using color balance. If I go in here where I've got color gain and color offset, you can see if I put the color gain to black and play, now the particles are emitting off the entire surface because it's emitting from dark. If I put the color offset up to white, now we've got no emission. So what I could do in here is if I go in and say, maybe map my color offset with a ramp, and then my ramp that I put in here, maybe I'll get it to just be black and white. So I'm just going to go and make a couple changes to that. What we can see is if we look in the multi-lister, the change that we've made. And so I'm going to go in here now, and you might not be able to sort of tell what you've done by looking at the surface, but I could always go in, create a new shader, maybe like a Lambert shader, that I assign to that cylinder. So assign. And then for that Lambert shader, maybe I'll just grab that ramp that I just created, assign it to its color, so that if I turn textures on, I can see how that's mapping. So I can tell that that ramp is supposed to be a U ramp, for example. And then as a U ramp, if I now go to my particle emission, okay, what we're going to see is that since it's emitting from dark, we're getting more emission at the top. But I'm going to edit this ramp so that basically what we'll have is no interpolation. So I'm going to put interpolation to none, modify it like this, okay, so that if the whole thing is white, what we're basically going to see when I hit play is they're only emitting from the bottom. If I move this all the way up so the whole thing is black, now it's just emitting from that region. Because remember, this ramp is multiplying itself with our ramp. So if you, or our file texture. So if you look at the file texture there, you can see as I make changes to the ramp, what happens to the file texture. So you can see by going in and keyframing. So let's say we go in and I move this down to the bottom, so that the emission is only at the bottom of our object. I'm going to go to frame 1 on my time slider and keyframe the position of my ramp. Then maybe I'll go to, let's say, frame 120, put that ramp all the way up to there, set another keyframe on its position, okay, And now when I go in and hit play, what's going to happen is you have to also make sure you're using the right kind of keys. I'm going to switch to spline keys, grab my ramp, set a key, go to frame 120, move that up, set another key on it, and then I'll go in and hit play. And now you can see our particles are growing up the surface in a spiraling pattern. Okay. And so basically, because we've got an animated ramp that's multiplying the color offset, or being added to the color offset for our emission map. And so it's pretty snazzy stuff you can do. So we've seen the paint textures tool, we've seen using Artisan to do the paint textures tool, we've seen paint effects, we've seen Photoshop, Flash, using file sequences, and then using procedural textures to do quite a wide range of particle emission design. So if I go in here, some other things that we want to talk about as far as designing this is, let's say we go and completely now try an example where we deal with procedural emission. I'm going to go and make another new file and just open something that's a little bit of a, let's say, an example for that, like this burning cylinder file, where if I go in and just get the file to load, what we'll see if I just grab a QuickTime movie of this is that basically what will happen is we'll see the particles sort of grow up into sort of spiraling and then sort of engulf the entire surface. And this is something that I did again using texture rate. And so we can see that it's sort of crawling up the surface in this line, and then at a certain point now it starts sort of covering the entire surface, engulfing it in this sort of green flame fiery looking stuff. So again, animated texture rate. So this is done completely procedurally though, without using file textures. And so the way that I went about doing something like this is, if I go and make, again, a new file, I'm going to create a cylinder. And then for this, let's say I sort of scale this down a little bit, get the channel box up the number of sections, turn it, and then before we even turn it into a surface emitter, let's go and design the texture for it. That's going to be used for our emission. So I'm going to have to open the multi-lister, create a new shader. I'll just use Lambert. I'll assign it to that object. And then I'll start by just throwing a ramp on the color, so that now I can see this color ramp, which I'm going to set to be a U ramp. And then, actually, you know what? I'll use it as a V ramp, but let's make a couple quick changes. So I'm going to go in here, get this, let's say, to be white, so that now what we're going to see in here, and actually let's go and get it so that that's black instead. If we look in the scene, I'm going to start moving that around so that that is sort of sitting around that point right there. And we can see that black line. So already you can imagine if that was an emission map where the particles would emit from. So the next thing that I might do is now go in and maybe add a little bit of noise. And so you can see how if I just put a little bit of noise on the ramp, how it sort of is going to sort of randomize that. And remember that I can click on the shader, go to the hardware texture tab, and where it says texture quality, I can put it up to high quality. So it looks a lot cleaner. So that now I can just go back to my ramp and continue working on that. And so you can imagine, like, you could animate the noise, for example. And if you animated the noise, your texture emission or your particle emission would be based on the animation we do right there. Okay. So I also could go in here and start dealing with for this ramp, its color gain and color offset. And so at this point, maybe I'll be happy with that emission, but then I'll go down to the color balance, and we've got color gain and color offset. Well, since black is emitting, maybe I'll go in and offset it with a ramp. And so I'll go and grab another ramp for color offset, and instead of using the colors, I'm just going to use black and white. And so let's go and get this to be white, and then we'll be able to see how I can go in here, set it to a U ramp, maybe sort of invert this a little bit, and now you can imagine that if I went and animated this ramp, which is mapped to the color offset, how we can get that to grow up the surface. So the fire can sort of slowly crawl up that surface. So it animates going up this way. And then when it gets up to here, then you'd animate this one moving up to thicken it so that it gets thicker and thicker. Okay. Once you've animated it getting thicker, You then go back to this ramp, and then you could start animating these. So this one could sort of move out, and this one could start to move out, so that the fire starts to eventually engulf the entire surface, just by using some simple ramp animation, just by animating your little placement markers. So going back to this ramp over here, so if you're not sure on exactly how to animate ramps, I can just go back here and just set some simple keys. Spline keys, go to frame 1, just click on my little position marker right there, and then spline keys, right click on position, set a key. Then move this all the way up to the top, maybe move to frame 10, okay, this is depending on how fast you want it to move, and then set a key. And then also click the one on the bottom now, set a key on that, and then slide that up, move forward a few frames, and key that. So that now what we're going to see if we start sort of moving through is notice how Maya, if I just hit play, actually updates procedural shader animation directly on your object. You just have to make sure that your shader is set to high quality for it to do this. And so now we can see how that's sort of crawling up the surface, and then I can go and jump over to the ramp that this is inputting into and set some keys on this one. So maybe I'll go in and set a couple keys at frame 1. So I'm going to go to frame 1, key the position, click, key the position, so that all of those have had their position keyed. Let me just sort of scoot that down a little bit at frame 1. And then maybe, let's say around frame 40, I key them again. Key, key, key. Although I'm going to switch to flat keyframes for this. So set a key, set a key, set a key. And then let's say around frame 60, I'll just sort of move these up. Okay. And then set some more keys. So key, click that one, key, and then that one, key. And now when I hit play, it's going to move up the surface and then also start expanding. And it looks like I forgot to set a key on this one. And so all I need to do to set those keys is keyframe it, and then at frame 40, move it up here and keyframe that to sort of see that result go in. It's to see how it's eventually moving out. And it's just a matter of, I don't want to spend too much time on this example, but you can get the idea of how animating the shader animation will give us some pretty interesting results on how the particles can emit off the surface. So that's exactly what we had going on in this example where I just had this burning cylinder, where we can see in here that if I go and select the cylinder and just assign the shader, we can see how that crawls up. And then by having that same file texture, the ramp, just assigned by literally going in here, we'd grab the emitter that's sitting inside that cylinder, because that cylinder is set to be a surface emitter, go to the attribute editor, and down here where we've got texture emission attributes, you can see the texture rate is mapped. So you would just grab your ramp, ramp 1, which is the one that's animated, and that's what's mapped to the texture rate. And so in here we can see as we play this back in this file, how those particles are sort of moving up because they're only emitting from where we have a dark texture. And so another example of texture rate. So a couple other things that I can show real quick as far as using particles or using textures to do surface emission, okay, other than dealing with all of the procedural stuff, is also be aware that if you're dealing with paint effects and paint effect strokes, that if I just sort of open a scene, let me grab this one, and let me hide the render view window. Okay. Basically what I've gotten here is just a sort of simple terrain that was just modeled using, let me just switch the perspective window and sort of tumble around a little bit. We can see that it's a terrain just modeled with Artisan and whatnot that has textures on it. I've got some paint effect strokes. So something that you can do with Maya now is you can instance paint effect strokes to particles. And so basically I painted using the paint textures tool where I wanted my particles to emit from on this surface, and then I instanced paint effect strokes onto them. So it's a very sort of intuitive way to design where your paint effect strokes are. So if you need to do a forest with trees or a landscape or farmland or whatever, just go and take your surface, paint textures in black and white for where you want your particles to emit, have your particles emit with a speed of 0, and then you can go in and instance particles or instance paint effect strokes onto those. And then in here, let's say if I go and sort of delete those strokes, we'll also see in this file that I've also, if I sort of display a couple other particle objects in here, and if I hit play, what we're going to see down there is I've got some sprites. So we see we have this kind of like little river sort of moving down here, and then basically I've got some sort of smoke and fire sort of making its way down the river as if the river is sort of catching on fire. And that's also done using the Paint Textures tool. So I basically went in on this surface and just painted, along where that river is in black using the Paint Textures tool, and that's my emitter or emission rate. And then I used a ramp with the color offset that I animated to get it to look like it's slowly moving down the river this way. And so you can see when I hit play how eventually those particles start moving their way down. And so let's say for now we just sort of hide what looks like fire, hide selection, so we just see the smoke, and we can sort of see that sprite smoke sort of moving its way down where that river is, or crack or ravine or whatever that's supposed to be. So it's pretty neat. And then another example where I did something like this is this one, where, just give it a couple seconds to load. And basically, if I sort of hit play in this file, let me get rid of the channel box. Okay. I basically have this object, which was just a cylinder that I sculpted with Artisan and did a blend shape on with a twist deformer. And you can see how that kind of spins up and then changes shape. And then particles start getting emitted. So it's kind of as if it's some sort of gnarled tree trunk, weird looking thing or whatever. And if I hide the particles for a second, you can see what this looks like in the scene. And so basically what I wanted is wherever I had the kind of knots in the tree, I wanted smoke to come out of them. And so I literally took that surface and used the Paint Textures tool and literally just painted where I wanted those particles to emit from. And so if I go back and get those particles to pop up, you can then see that the particles are just emitting. And that surface is skinned, but just even though it's skinned, it doesn't matter because the texture rate will update if that surface is animated or deformed in some way. So if I go and grab the QuickTime movie for that one, we'll be able to see what that one looks like, which is in here, say this one. So here this one is, and it's just some software rendered smoke. And so that's why we're getting shadows cast from it, which sprite smoke wouldn't be able to do. So it's pretty trippy looking, but again, we've just got the smoke to be emitting off that tree exactly where we want it to be emitting from, just relying on as built-in tools, not relying on paint packages or anything else, just grabbing the Paint Textures tool and painting on surfaces. Really, really powerful, cool stuff that's relatively straightforward to do. So that's about how much time we have for surface emission. And this is where we're going to have to stop. So there you go.